Hey everyone! Ready to dive into a spine-chilling story? Today, we're exploring a real-life mystery involving an abandoned hospital in Gary, Indiana. This story is packed with inexplicable disappearances and supernatural events that defy logic. So before we begin, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss any stories like this one. Turn off the lights, prepare for a chill down your spine, and let's unravel this dark mystery together. Chapter 1. The Night of Exploration. It was a cold, dark October night when four friends, Mark, Jenny, Carlos, and Sarah, decided to venture into the abandoned hospital in Gary, Indiana. The building, once a prominent medical center, was now in a state of decay, covered in graffiti and with broken windows. The atmosphere around the hospital was laden with an eerie feeling, with the wind whistling through the barren trees and distant sirens echoing from the past. Armed only with flashlights and cameras, the friends were eager to debunk the legends surrounding the place. As they crossed the rusty gate, they were greeted by a heavy silence, interrupted only by their own footsteps. Each corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, and the feeling of being watched began to settle in. The charged atmosphere made even their nervous laughter feel subdued as they ventured further into the unknown. Chapter 2. The First Manifestations. As the friends explored the hospital's corridors, they soon noticed that something was off. The flashlights flickered intermittently, and the silence was frequently broken by low, indistinct whispers coming from all directions. They tried to rationalize the noises, attributing them to the wind blowing through broken windows or rusted pipes. But the voices persisted, growing clearer and more unsettling, seemingly calling their names. Jenny, usually the bravest, began to feel an inexplicable chill that seemed to emanate from the walls. The air was thick, and the sensation of being watched intensified. Every time she turned around, she felt as though something was following her. The friends tried to stay together, but the growing unease made even their laughter seem strained, as shadows danced on the walls and the increasing fear became almost tangible. Chapter 3. The Disappearance. As they continued to search for Jenny, the group's sense of dread deepened. The flickering flashlights cast eerie shadows on the walls, amplifying their fear. The once familiar corridors had become a twisted maze. Desperation gripped Carlos, Mark, and Sarah as they called out for Jenny, but their voices were swallowed by the oppressive silence. They split up briefly, hoping to cover more ground, but the eerie quiet only heightened their anxiety. Each room they entered seemed more decrepit than the last, with broken furniture and discarded medical equipment lying around. The hospital's unsettling atmosphere made it feel like it was shifting and closing in on them. The group reconvened, exhausted and increasingly frantic. Every shadow seemed to play tricks on their eyes, and the whispers they heard earlier now felt like they were echoing in their heads, growing louder and more insistent. Their hearts pounded as they faced the realization that Jenny was nowhere to be found, and the fear of what might have happened to her began to overwhelm them. Chapter 4. The Encounter with the Inexplicable. Determined to find Jenny, the group descended into the basement of the hospital, hoping to uncover some clue. The air grew colder and more oppressive as they moved through the dark, damp corridors. The basement was filled with the stench of decay, and the walls were lined with rusting medical equipment. In one room, they found old, dusty beds and medical devices that seemed to have been abandoned in haste. The group was unnerved by the scratch marks on the walls, which appeared to be made by someone desperately trying to escape. Sarah's headache intensified, and she felt a sudden wave of nausea. She glanced into a broken mirror and saw a dark, indistinct figure standing behind her. The sight was so unsettling that she stumbled backward, her heart racing. The others, alarmed by her reaction, gathered around her as Carlos found an old, dusty diary on the floor. The diary's pages were filled with disturbing entries about cruel experiments conducted on patients, designed to break their sanity. The final entries described a young woman who had disappeared during one of these experiments, and the similarities to Jenny's case were chilling. The group's horror deepened as they realized they were caught up in something far more sinister than they had imagined. Chapter 5. The Grim Discovery. Carlos read aloud from the diary, which detailed the horrific experiments performed on patients. The diary described how patients were subjected to intense psychological torment, forced to confront their deepest fears. The vivid descriptions of mental manipulation and torture were deeply disturbing. The experiments aimed to induce severe psychological distress, and the diary's final entries described a patient who had vanished, never to be seen again. The parallels between the diary's account and their own experiences were too close to ignore. The group felt trapped in a nightmarish scenario, with the hospital seemingly feeding off their fear. Shadows and whispers intensified, creating an atmosphere of relentless dread. The oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger, and each shadow seemed to come alive with malicious intent. Carlos and the others struggled to maintain their composure as they tried to piece together their next move. The diary's revelations made it clear that the hospital was not just a place of physical decay but a site of profound psychological horror. Chapter 6. The Revealing Diary. As Carlos continued to read from the diary, the group's sense of impending doom grew. The diary detailed the experiments with an unsettling clarity, describing how patients were subjected to extreme psychological stress and hallucinations. The last entries revealed that those who endured these experiments were never seen again, their fates sealed by the hospital's malevolent design. The group's anxiety mounted as the descriptions in the diary began to mirror their own experiences. The air around them seemed to thicken with fear, and the shadows on the walls took on a life of their own. The whispers they had heard earlier now felt like they were inside their heads, creating a symphony of terror that was impossible to ignore. The oppressive atmosphere made it difficult for them to think clearly, and every attempt to rationalize their situation seemed futile. The hospital seemed to be a living entity, manipulating their perceptions and emotions. The group struggled to focus on finding an escape route, but the growing sense of panic made it nearly impossible to think rationally. Chapter 7. The Final Confrontation. Determined to escape, the group decided to head back to the ground floor and search for an exit. However, the hospital's layout seemed to have changed. The once familiar corridors were now a disorienting maze, with rooms and hallways stretching out in unfamiliar directions. The group's sense of direction became increasingly unreliable, and doors that had previously been open were now inexplicably locked. The oppressive silence was broken only by their frantic footsteps and the occasional, unsettling whisper. Sarah, overwhelmed by fear, began to hear her name being called out in a haunting, echoing voice. The sense of losing her sanity was palpable, and she struggled to hold on to her grasp on reality. The group's attempts to find an exit became increasingly desperate, with each turn leading them further into the labyrinth. The hospital seemed to be playing with their minds, trapping them in a nightmarish cycle of confusion and fear. As the night wore on, the group's hope of escaping the hospital seemed to fade, replaced by the growing terror of being trapped in an endless nightmare. Chapter 8. The Unexpected Farewell. Eventually, the group discovered a staircase leading to the roof. The fresh air provided a brief respite from the oppressive atmosphere of the hospital, but their relief was short-lived. On the roof, they encountered a chilling sight. A figure that appeared to be Mark was standing on the edge, looking down. As they approached, they realized it was merely a trick of the shadows, an illusion created by the hospital's malevolent presence. The realization that their perception was being manipulated deepened their sense of despair. The hospital seemed to be toying with their fears, and the feeling of being watched never left them. Sarah, in a moment of desperation, broke down in tears, while Carlos tried to comfort her. The only apparent way out was to jump to the adjacent building, despite the inherent danger. The decision to leap was made quickly, driven by the need to escape the nightmarish environment. As they prepared for the jump, the fear of the unknown and the terror of their situation weighed heavily on them. Chapter 9. The Unlikely Escape. Carlos and Sarah made the leap to the adjacent building, their hearts pounding as they landed. The impact was jarring, but they managed to stay on their feet. As they looked back at the abandoned hospital, it appeared even more menacing. The building seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, and the flickering lights created an unsettling atmosphere. Shadows danced in the windows, and the silhouettes of Mark and Jenny seemed to watch them with a haunting calm. The feeling that the hospital was still with them lingered as they made their way back. The experience left a profound mark on their lives, and the fear of being followed never completely dissipated. The trauma of the night haunted them long after they had left the hospital behind. The sense of dread that had accompanied them during their escape remained, a constant reminder of the horrors they had faced. Chapter 10. The Dark Legacy. Carlos and Sarah managed to escape physically, but the psychological scars from their ordeal never faded. They endured weeks of nightmares and a persistent sense of paranoia. The abandoned hospital was eventually demolished, but the site where it once stood continued to be avoided by locals. Reports of strange occurrences and unsettling feelings persisted in the area. The legend of the haunted hospital lived on, recounted with a shiver by those who knew its dark history. The stories of Jenny and Mark's disappearances remained unresolved, and the hospital became a symbol of the terror that lurks in the shadows of the unknown. The impact of the hospital's legacy continued to resonate, leaving an indelible mark on the community and those who had dared to explore its dark corridors. So, what did you think of this chilling story? If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to keep up with more stories like this one. Share it with your friends and let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.